Look up almost any English village and you can find it written down in a book from 1086. Your town, its fields, what it was worth, who owned it. Now try to do the same for a Scottish village. You cannot, because it was never written. England has the Domesday Book. Scotland has nothing like it, and never did. And that single missing book tells you almost everything about why England and Scotland became two completely different countries. No Scottish Domesday Book was ever made, not in 1086, not ever. And that is not a lost volume, or a book that sank without trace. Scotland never had one, because Scotland was a completely different kind of country, built in a completely different way. So, stay with me, because to understand why one half of this island could be counted and the other half could not, you have to understand how these two kingdoms were really born, and they could hardly be more different. And if you like this, the real history of Britain, the two nations underneath the one island, no myths and no nonsense, subscribe to British Bloodlines before we begin. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here every week, and there is a great deal more coming. It is free, and you will not miss the next one. So, to see why Scotland has no Domesday Book, we first have to ask a question almost nobody thinks to ask. Why did England have one? Because a survey like Domesday was not normal. It was extraordinary. And it was only possible because of two things England had that almost nowhere else did. The first was a machine. Not a machine of iron and gears, but a machine of government. Long before the Normans ever came, Anglo-Saxon England was one of the most organized states in all of Europe. It was already divided into shires, the counties many of you still live in today. Each shire was split into smaller units called hundreds. There were local courts that met on a schedule. There was a national tax on land called the geld that had been collected for generations. And to collect a tax on land, you need lists. You need to know who holds what. So England already had the habit and the paperwork of measuring itself. That was the tool. But a tool is no use without a reason to pick it up. And in 1066, England was handed the most dramatic reason imaginable: the Norman Conquest. When William won at Hastings, he did not just take the crown. Over the next 20 years, he tore out the entire ruling class of England by the roots. The old English lords, thousands of them, lost everything, and their land was handed to a few hundred of William's Norman followers. It was one of the most complete takeovers in European history, and that gave William a burning need. He was sitting on a conquered country, held down by a small number of foreign lords, and he needed to know exactly what he now ruled. Who held which land, what it was worth, what he could tax, what he could demand. So there it is. England had the means, that ancient Anglo-Saxon machine of shires and taxes and lists, and England had the motive of violent conquest that had just turned the whole country upside down and left a new king desperate to take stock. Put those two things together and you get the Domesday Book. Now, hold that in your mind, because here is the whole answer to our question. Scotland had neither of those things. Not the machine, not the conquest, and without them, a Domesday Book was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Let us start with how Scotland was actually built, because it is a completely different story from England. England, in a sense, was forged in fire, hammered into one kingdom, and then conquered whole. Scotland was not conquered into being. It was assembled slowly over centuries out of different peoples. There were the Picts, the ancient, mysterious people of the north. There were the Gaels, the Scots, who came from the west. There were the Britons of the old kingdom of Strathclyde. And there were the Norse, the Vikings in the Isles and along the coasts. Over hundreds of years, these peoples came together, mostly through overlordship and marriage and gradual absorption into the kingdom that became Scotland. There was no single year zero, no one moment when a conqueror seized everything and needed to write it all down. Scotland simply grew together, out of many, and the way it was governed was just as different. This is the part I really want you to understand, because it is where the myth gets it wrong. People sometimes imagine medieval Scotland as a wild, backward place with none of England's sophistication. That is not true, and it is not fair. Scotland was not less organized than England. It was organized in a completely different way. Where England ran on shires and written taxes, Scotland ran on people, on lords and kinship. Beneath the king were the great provincial rulers, the mormaers. The word means something like great steward or great officer. Beneath them were the heads of the local kindreds. And the king was held up by these men and their families, not by a huge staff of clerks and tax collectors. And crucially, the king was not paid in the same way. In England, the crown taxed land in silver, which meant counting and recording. In Scotland, the king was largely supported by tribute paid in kind, in cattle, in goods, and in something called hospitality. The king would travel around his kingdom, and his lords were obliged to feed him and house him and supply him as he went. Think about what that means. A king who rules by traveling around and being fed by his lords does not need a giant written survey of every field in the country. He does not have a national land tax that requires lists. So, Scotland never built that machine of measurement in the first place. The tool that made Domesday possible in England simply did not exist north of the border. And there was one more thing that made a single survey impossible. Scotland was not one uniform country. In the lowlands in the south, life looked more and more like England over time. But in the highlands in the west, the old Gaelic world carried on, with its own language, its own customs, and its own completely different ways of measuring land. With strange and beautiful units you will not find in any English record. Davokes and ounce lands and penny lands, based on cattle and tribute, not on plows and taxes. You could not have wrapped one single survey around a country that was two worlds at once. It would have been like trying to measure two different countries with one ruler. Now, before I tell you the great twist in this story, and there is a wonderful twist, let me ask you that quick favor. If you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. Telling the real story of these two nations, England and Scotland, is exactly why this channel exists, and there is so much more of it to come. So here is the twist, because you might be thinking, all right, but Scotland did eventually get castles and knights and lords with Norman French names, the Bruces, the Stuarts. Where did they come from if there was no conquest? And this is the beautiful part. Scotland was not conquered by the Normans. Scotland invited them in. In the 1100s, a Scottish king named David I, who had spent time at the English court and admired its world of knights and castles and charters, deliberately brought that world north. He handed lands to Norman and Breton and Flemish families in return for their service. He founded towns. He created local officials called sheriffs on the English model. He built great abbeys. He minted Scotland's first coins. And the families he invited in became some of the most famous names in all of Scottish history. The family called de Bruce, who became the Bruces. The family who served as royal stewards, the Stuarts, who would one day become kings not just of Scotland, but of England too. Sit with that irony for a moment. The very families who would later lead Scotland in its long, ferocious wars for independence against England, the Bruces, the Stuarts, were descended from Normans that a Scottish king welcomed in, by choice, with open arms. England got its Normans through conquest. Scotland got its Normans through invitation, and that difference is the whole story. But even then, this new Norman world only took hold in part of Scotland. The lowlands feudalized. The highlands stayed Gaelic. So Scotland became a hybrid, a kingdom of two halves. And still, no single survey could ever have captured it. Which leaves one last question. If Scotland kept its own records in its own way, where are they? Why do we know so much less about medieval Scotland than medieval England? And here the story turns genuinely tragic, because a great deal of Scotland's memory was not just never written in Domesday form. It was lost. When the English King Edward I invaded Scotland at the end of the 1200s, he carried off much of the Scottish royal archive to London, along with the very stone of destiny the Scottish kings were crowned upon. Some of those records were meant to come home. Many never did. And then came one of the saddest single moments in the history of record-keeping anywhere. In 1661, a ship called the Elizabeth of Burntisland set sail to carry a mass of Scottish records back home to Scotland after they had been taken south. Nearly 2 tons of documents. Barrels and barrels of Scotland's written past. The ship sank. Off the coast of northern England, in stormy weather, it went down. And it took with it records from the reigns of Robert the Bruce and his son, centuries of Scotland's memory, lost to the sea in a single night. So, when people say Scotland has fewer old records than England, this is part of why. Not because the Scots were careless, or primitive, or did not write things down, but because so much of what they did write was carried off, or scattered, or sunk. So let us bring the whole story home. England could count itself in 1086 because it had 2 things almost no one else had: an ancient machine of government, all shires and taxes and lists, inherited from the Anglo-Saxons, and a violent conquest that gave a new king the burning need to take stock of everything he had seized. Scotland had neither. It was not hammered into one kingdom and conquered whole. It was gently assembled over centuries out of Picts and Gaels and Britons and Norse. It was governed not by clerks and taxes, but by lords and kinship and cattle and hospitality. It welcomed its Normans in by invitation rather than having them forced upon it. It remained 2 worlds in one, lowland and highland, that no single survey could ever have measured, and much of what it did record was later lost to an English king and a stormy sea. That is not the story of a lesser country. It is the story of a different one. 2 kingdoms on one island that were never the same, and the missing Domesday Book is the proof. So now I want to hear from you. Are your roots on the English side of that line, in the land of shires and Domesday? Or on the Scottish side, in the world of mormaers and clans and cattle tribute? Do you carry one of those invited Norman names, a Bruce or a Stuart, or an older Gaelic name from the world that came before them? Tell me in the comments where your family stands, on which side of that ancient border. I read every single one, and I would love to know which of these 2 very different countries your blood runs back to. And if this gave you even one thing you did not know, do me a favor and subscribe before you go. Every week we uncover another piece of the real story of Britain, the peoples, the kingdoms, and the history hiding just under the surface. There is a whole island of it here, and we are only just getting started. Because that line across the map, the one where the Great Survey stops, is not just a line where a book ran out. It is the seam where 2 different worlds met and never quite fused. 2 ways of building a country. 2 ways of remembering. And we are, all of us on this island, the children of one side of it or the other. Stay close. We are only just getting started.